How long is it expected to go for? I'm gonna start now, basically. But I'm not 100% sure. It's been a while since I've gone through this and I've added things to it. So, feel free to leave at any point if you need to. I'm recording this. It might be quite long, because I'm going to try to cover a breadth of information. Um, so hello everyone on Zoom. Thank you for joining me. I made this resource for UQ internals to give people information about international relations. But we haven't found a good opportunity prior to Easters for it, and Easters will likely have a number of international relations topics. So having getting a general level of exposure to concepts in international relations is quite important. So I set this up for the UQ contingent, but because it's on Zoom, I thought might as well open it up to other people if they wish to do it. So before I start, uh, if you want to look at other things about international relations, this training not only draws upon things that UQDS training officers have talked about in the past, but also there's a really good seminar by Will Ryan from Sydney, specifically about the area of armed conflict in international relations, which I will discuss, but there's a whole seminar on the ADC YouTube channel and it's very, very good. So there is definitely overlap in some of the things that I will discuss that Will probably goes into a bit more detail about in his seminar. So that's on the ADC YouTube channel. As for just a couple disclaimers, as you may know, I'm just a student. I'm not an expert. No way have any professional. I'm not doing this in any professional capacity in international relations. I'm just a student who has an interest in international relations, and this doesn't necessarily reflect my beliefs or the beliefs of the UQ Debating Society. It's treat this as like a very brief taster of different concepts in international relations, in which there is a bit more of a focus on breadth of subject as opposed to like depth of subject. Just because you wouldn't be able to do justice to anything if you truly went into a significant amount of depth, but I think I've done a relatively good job at giving enough information for people to do their own reading and stuff like that if they wish to do that. Um, so generally, I'm gonna just go through a bunch of different concepts in international relations, starting with like about the theories surrounding international relations, and then through that, lots of like global trends, examples, historical context behind lots of things in international relations. Uh, I'll also mention a couple different IR motions that sometimes people encounter in debates that relate to the different subject areas, and then just like general tips about how to deal with international relations in debating. The bulk of the information is more just things that are happening in the world of geopolitics. There's definitely better debaters out there than me who can give more specific information about like tips and tricks in this context. But I've debated for a while, so I can at least give some advice and some help in that regard. So I think the first thing to understand when it comes to analyzing or looking at the concept of geopolitics in general is understanding that many different theories have sort of been crafted together over the course of a couple centuries by many different scholars, many different people in the international relations community. And a lot of those theories often are predicated or often start exploring the idea that the global order is anarchic. And what that means is essentially that the global order is just a bunch of states and a bunch of states governing themselves, but without a central point of authority to govern the entire world order. And therefore, there isn't like one singular entity that governs what every single state should do and what every single state ought to do and can like do that successfully. And therefore, every state is kind of going about their own thing, to put it in sort of a layman's way. The world order, sort of how we see it now and how states and how borders work, that conception came around in 1648. So after a bunch of conflicts between numerous European powers, they essentially came together and codified principles of sovereignty and laid like the very basic foundational principles for concepts of international law and multilateralism. So before the Treaty of Westphalia, most state authority, from what people can observe, was kind of fragmentary, and it was fragmentary along the lines of like religion and settlement, warlords, and different feudal hierarchies. So you would go into a lot of communities, and sometimes it wasn't necessarily clear cut that you were like sovereign territory of the Spanish Empire, you were sovereign territory of the Holy Roman Empire. And if anyone's ever seen a map of the Holy Roman Empire or like Germania over that sort of period in time, it is an absolute mess in terms of like what people think that the different types of borders looked like. like so this was the a treaty that at least for the modern Western world, kind of formalized some of those basic principles, even though some societies did already exhibit a lot of those characteristics beforehand. I think just the sort of point of difference became defining borders more clearly a little bit. But also to that extent, most people still, despite defining borders and sovereignty, viewed the world through the lens of anarchy, meaning that the world is just composed of a bunch of sovereign states without an innate central authority to govern them. And as a result, it sort of creates an incentive for self-help and like a drive for that state to self-preserve. Most people in international relations treat the state and the entity of the state as like the highest order in international relations, and that it is the primary actor that sort of determines how the global order and geopolitics runs. Um, at least in terms of like most of the mainstream international relations scholars, but there's definitely offshoots that offer like differing perspectives. And even though anarchy doesn't mean like Mad Max, like it's inherently anarchic. I mean, depending on who you ask, depending on the scholars that you ask, it definitely sees characteristics of states acting in their own self-interest. But I think generally it's like quite empirically true that states have reacted to this sort of state of anarchy in different ways. Not everyone has been driven to the same extent by like a self-help incentive. And so I think lots of scholarship and ontology and international relations tries to explain and rationalize that. Some of the main theories, and this is a brief overview, is firstly realism. Realists in international relations kind of focus more on the fact that the states are self-interested and that there is an inherent level of competition for the survival of states and a level of sort of, I think, black and white or like a binary of state survival, given that there's only so much material power in the world that states can try to compete over. And as a result, I think a lot of realists focus on things like militarization and having arms to protect yourself, and something called comparative security, which essentially just means like states like judging one another and comparing each other on metrics of like of material power in the context of military power, and therefore kind of assessing like threats and security from that perspective nearly exclusively, and sort of creating a security dilemma where like everyone's constantly conscious of the fact that other states might be trying to take things from them and are self-interested. And sort of realists kind of not entirely, but reject mostly the conception that like there are norms that can exist in the international community that can bridge borders and therefore drive things like cooperation, etc., and that state self-interest will always just prevail in most contexts. Liberalism is quite different. Liberalism focuses more on that norms can exist between states that can formulate into things like international organizations and international law that govern the different actions of states in a way that you can kind of plaster over this anarchic state that different that the anarchic state that exists between lots of global powers, and they reject things like power politics. And the inherent need to like militarize and dominate material power in order for a state to get up over another state or for a state to survive, and emphasize this idea of like mutual cooperation between states. And sort of like alternative theory to that is something called constructivism. Constructivism is sort of the conception of international relations as being and the politics of international relations as being a construct of beliefs and identities and less about material factors, de-emphasizing the role of the state as an entity. In international relations, in terms of terminology, people can refer to the state, like the government and that entity that operates, and then like the nation state, which is that plus the people and the society of said state. So scholars that sort of fall in these different brackets and different theories and stuff like that try to rationalize how states act, how they ought to act, and try to explain how the international order works. This is definitely not a comprehensive definition list, but this is just a basic idea of how of what people sort of fall into. And these theories often well, mainly liberalism and realism often try to point to the key concept that is quite important throughout the rest of all the content that I have about polarity and axes of the world order. So often when people look at the different states that are competing or cooperating, whatever it may be, there has often been like both occurring at the same time. The question of most scholars is like what is more sustainable and what is just like more likely to happen, in which realists think that like in imploding and everyone competing against each other is more likely, and liberalists think that the world is likely to push towards cooperation to promote peace and stuff like that. The concept of like unipolarity is the idea that like there is one power, maybe like a superpower, and they are the most powerful country on earth, and no country can like materially challenge them, and then by virtue they control a lot of the international systems that exist. I think an example of this would be like the United States after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but before the rise of China in the 1990s, where there wasn't a power that could like feasibly challenge the US's capability to project into different regions around the world, even in regions that were very, very far away from the United States. Different to that is bipolarity, where the world kind of is organized around two different axis points, which was probably how most of the Cold War was characterized, in which you had the US and sort of the West surrounding it versus like the Soviet Union and then like the Soviet blocs and different communist states surrounding it, and those two being like the largest powers in terms of material strength. And like most of the world's dynamic kind of being orientated around their relationship or lack thereof a relationship in some instances. And then there's the concept of multipolarity, which a lot of scholars, and I think this is just true, is where the world is currently heading, in which like the material power of the United States is diminishing, and you have a skewing of power dynamics. So the rise of China, for example, although Russia is probably not as comparable of a power in terms of its material capacity, it is still quite powerful. And then the rise of like middle states or middle powers like Australia or Mexico, for example, that still have a significant amount of influence on the world order. So I think the first thing to sort of naturally move into based off of that is armed conflict, war, and power politics in international relations. There's this famous quote when people study armed conflict. It's by Karl von Clausewitz. I think he's like a Prussian general or something. That war is merely the continuation of politics by other means, which essentially just means that like lots of things in politics and lots of political goals still just bleed into foreign policy and how you go about achieving that foreign policy. Um, and in the area of war and armed conflict, there's a couple different things. Firstly, is the concept of soft power, which exists outside of the scope of war when states are trying to achieve objectives or use influence without the use of like actual force. In which soft power is the ability to influence states without coercion. Often this can look like there being like mutual understanding, respect, and maybe investment due to socio-cultural and political values that are shared between states, or states promoting their values, their political values and ideological values in other states. I think if it's like it's essentially how a country can appeal to other countries and thus influence each other's actions and beliefs. And like that's often done through things like calls of diplomacy, exchange, joint collaboration, which can often manifest in collaboration in science or the private sector. An example of this is like the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs running like a scholarship program to send like Australian students overseas. That's like a small example of where like soft power is what states often use before there is the use of force and coercion, and is the type of power that is most commonly observed around the world, like on a day-to-day basis. Beyond that, there is then hard power. So that is the military and economic coercive capacity of the state. And often this is going to be contingent on like the size and the reach of this of said economy, um, and like contingent on then the funding, technology, and the projection of the state's armed forces. So like intuitively, the United States has a greater projection capability in terms of its material power than Australia or New Zealand does, just because of the size of its armed forces. And also the fact that it has lots of overseas military bases, for example, which means that it has lots of different assets that can project that hard power at its will around the world. But also another example of hard power, moving beyond just like traditional, you have more guns or you have more bombs, is the ability to enact things like sanctions or embargo other states through the use of said coercive power and that force. So that is another example of where like you are tangibly manipulating the international order through the use of material capacity. Speaking of military bases, for example, this is like a map of lots of different US military bases or different US military assets around the world, in which they store troops, they store weapons, etc. They store assets that can project their material capacity and their foreign policy around the world. They have by far the most amount of foreign military bases around the world. They have them on pretty much every single continent. So that is an example of where the US has a significant projection capability in terms of its hard power. Um, Whether that's used for good or bad is up to the world, but it certainly can be interesting. Currently, at the moment, there are multiple different armed conflicts that I think are important to know about that are occurring around the world, and maybe at some point, Easter's motions or other tournaments motions may touch upon them. Um, But I think generally, beside the actual areas where armed conflicts are happening, one of the things that will commonly be touched upon when you're talking about dynamics between countries and geopolitics is the idea of like flashpoints. And a flashpoint is essentially an area of growing tension between different states. So an example of a flashpoint is like the Taiwan Strait between Taiwan and then also like the South China Sea, for example. And usually those are places where wars are more likely to occur as a result of there being a lot of geopolitical tension between different states. But at the moment, there is uh, a pretty sad reality of growing armed conflict around the world. And like we see armed conflict in Ukraine, there is armed conflict in the Middle East currently. There's armed conflict, civil armed conflict in places like Sudan and Myanmar, and also a conflict in Rwanda as well. But that conflict can differ in scope and differ in size, and not all of that conflict is state-on-state conflict. As I'll discuss later, some of that conflict is non-state actors fighting state actors and forms of insurgency. So often when you look at flashpoints around the world in geopolitics, they have a few characteristics. Firstly, is you'll often see a significant amount of militarization, because often it is a focal point for states' differing strategic interests and objectives. And so as a result, you'll see a lot of force, the attempt to have force projection in the region. Uh, that often involves strategic positioning. So maybe you have different military assets in different areas to protect things like resources and trade lanes. But it also can come as a result of things like artificial borders. For example, as Europe sort of left a lot of its colonies, or a lot of its colonies gained independence, a lot of the borders and lines that were drawn on maps were completely artificial and arbitrary, and just kind of ran through places that didn't have like natural defenses or natural barriers, for example. And so as a result, it creates a lot of tensions to the extent that it has split up communities and has not taken into consideration maybe like historical or local will of people. And then this often manifests in things like border disputes, etc., in which one state claims a territory that another state has effective control over, and vice versa. It also can often be characterized by seeing lots of insurgency and separatism as a result of like border disputes, or people feeling like they are in territory controlled by an illegitimate actor. And often as a result of there being resources, border disputes, and all of those different things, you'll see militarization, military exercises, military testing as a strength, as a show of force. A good example in terms of military exercises is the Taiwan Strait, which, in order to sort of intimidate and project power, China, but also the United States and other different Indo-Pacific actors engage in military exercises around the island to sort of show off their force projection capabilities. Another example of a flashpoint is the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, in which there is a massive amount of military buildup between both sides. Like, I think on the North Korean end of the border, they have like 1 million active troops. Hundreds of thousands of those troops are stationed quite close to the border under the idea of being able to like launch an invasion of the South. North Korea is an extremely militarized society. It is a totalitarian hermit kingdom. It is one of the most unique, I think, actors in geopolitics to analyze. But the DMZ between the two states is one of the most heavily militarized places on the planet. And I'll have more examples of how that is very tense later. Another example that I've already mentioned is the South China Sea, in which China, characterized by the red dashes on the picture, claims a massive portion of the South China Sea, much to the dispute of like all the other states on the screen, like the Philippines and Vietnam, etc. And so there is a lot of tension around who is the sovereign owner of different parts of the South China Sea, because there's lots of different like islands and stuff, and like the Paracel Islands in the waters, and also lots of resources and fishing, etc. And like the international community, the UN, and arbitrating bodies have already basically declared that China's nine dash line is illegal. And just by looking at a picture of it, it is quite provocative. And so a lot of states feel like a lot of other states in the South China Sea feels like it goes against their incentives or their interests as well. Um, this is like a quote that I once found in a reading about the South China Sea, which basically is just like, it is a very, very complicated and very, very tense matter, and is probably one of the most fraught regions in terms of geopolitical tension, simultaneous to it being one of the most important regions because of how much trade goes through the region. Another flashpoint is the border between NATO and Russia. The so NATO is a collective defense arrangement, which I'll discuss in more detail later. But it has a growing border with Russia, and NATO was largely set up and expanded to counter perceived Russian aggression. So that is also a flashpoint with significant militarization. Another flashpoint is Kashmir, which is a northern region disputed by Pakistan and India. And also some areas are also disputed by China as well. And there's a lot of overlapping, a lot of areas where different countries administer it, but the other country claims it as their rightful and legitimate territory. And there has been sparks up in recent years between India and Pakistan about Kashmir and brief military skirmishes. Um, this is another flashpoint. Probably understand why it is currently a flashpoint. This is an old slide that I used to use from previous years. It is now escalated from just sort of a flashpoint of tension to now there being a full-blown armed conflict. Um, so I think you're probably all aware of it by looking at the news that there is now an armed conflict between Iran and different Persian Gulf states, the United States and Israel. So this is an example of where a significant amount of militarization has now blown up into a full-blown military conflict with massive implications for the global order. When it comes to debating about flashpoints specifically, I think it's good to characterize them with specificity. So talking about what has happened at those flashpoints, what the militarization has looked like, what has happened essentially in the context behind the incentives of the actors, but also impacting the dangers of increasing risk intentions in existing flashpoints. So if a debate is talking about a policy about like, I don't know, the South China Sea, for example, probably good to sort of build and like ideate cases that look at what the impacts of different policies are in potentially increasing or decreasing tensions in flashpoints, given that flashpoints have like the propensity to become armed conflicts to a greater degree than other areas in the world. But also, it's good to characterize how actors behave there. Is it like characterized by paranoia, extreme aggression? Um, and identifying the countries that are involved in that type of behavior potentially expands the scope of arguments. So for example, a debate like that is touching on the flashpoint of Taiwan and China probably also implicates the policy interests of ASEAN as well. This sort of points to the concept of in like sort of global affairs of strategic choke points, which are just geographical regions where that are very, very important, but are just geographically very, very small, and therefore one country has like a disproportionate amount of influence over whether those are secure and stable choke points. So as many of you probably have seen, the Strait of Hormuz has essentially been closed because of the risk to shipping. There's also, for example, the Strait of Malacca, which I think like 20 to 30% of the world's oil travels through it into the South China Sea, and that sits between Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. There's also the Suez and the Panama canals as well, which is like artificial constructs in Egypt and Panama that shipping can go through that those states exert some level of control on. Although I do believe the Panama Canal has recently been sold to like an equity firm or something like that. Um, this is like probably a little bit outdated. I think the numbers have changed, but it's generally the same, which is that especially the United States, countries spend tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars on their military. The US especially has a consistent trend of spending so much that it outstrips all the other countries behind it combined. But some of the other highest spenders in terms of spending on their military projection are actors like India, the UK, France, Germany, Russia, Saudi Arabia. I think most people kind of get a vibe of who the largest spenders of military power are. But I think in international relations, not just spending and throwing dollars at your military doesn't necessarily translate to success or being able to deliver on your strategic objectives as a state. Um, so why do countries go to war? Very complicated question. Uh, very, very simple and basic reasons why I think you can start to look at the incentives for war. I think one is the idea that there is an asymmetry. So there might be one power that is more powerful than another state, and therefore there is an increased incentive to exploit that power disadvantage and sort of go after that state if they're your rival, for example. A second reason is sometimes states go and trigger armed conflicts as like a preemptive measure. Particularly, like realists will often tell you to the extent that states are paranoid about the material power of other states, creating a security dilemma. It means that states will start the war first because they believe that that will be an advantage to them because they think the war is just inevitable anyway. Another one is like this kind of relates to like a window of opportunity, which is there's like a particular if, to the extent you believe conflict is probably inevitable, do you start it now, where the rival might be a little bit weaker, or do you gamble and wait and hope that they either continue to get weaker or maybe they end up strengthening and then you've lost your window of opportunity? Another thing is alliances and containment, which is particularly pertinent to US foreign policy in the Cold War, which is just like alliances, systems being developed in which states are obligated to protect one another in the event that one state in the alliance is attacked, but also the idea of trying to contain the influence of other states, like the US trying to contain the influence of the Soviet Union, resulting in like sponsoring conflicts, etc., to forcefully prevent the expansion of different powers, etc. But also, it can be examples of like states just being low on resources, desperate. The regime is desperate to survive, and as a result, it lashes out in an attempt to try to self-preserve, often not working out very well. Um, I think generally, when looking at debates about war specifically, I think war is a little bit speculative in terms of whether it will occur, will it, won't it? So I think when you're talking about debates that might touch on armed conflict, understanding that the just immediately trying to claim that a world war is going to start is probably going to be quite difficult to prove. So I think generally the strategy when you're looking at armed conflict is look at more like regional conflicts, proxy conflicts, civil conflict, civil armed conflicts, etc. Which occur more frequently and that can still have like a relationship with the debate potentially, or there might be still be implications for it. Just know that if you're having a debate about war, the worst case scenarios, you need to do way more mechanization in order to reach. Um, but I think that it's important then when you actually do war to be a bit more nuanced than just saying war is bad. Probably weigh the harms of war, particularly on civilians. I think those are the types of people that suffer the most as a result of war, armed conflict occurring, whether that be just like being killed directly by the use of military force or essential services and facilities and infrastructure being destroyed by things like bombing, etc., or maybe crops being destroyed as a result of bombing. Um, so I think it's good to put the to really ground arguments about armed conflict in the perspective of sympathetic actors like civilians. Um, I also think it's important to look at symmetry and asymmetry, which is just looking at the power capacity of both states. And if they go and clash in an armed conflict, what is likely to be the result? But also war arguments and debating often sees things like tipping point analysis, where like a team trying to prove that a war will happen has to prove like the tipping point to get over all of the barriers of war just being very costly and people just not liking war in general. And often you'll see in rebuttal teams like push against those arguments saying you haven't proven the tipping point or whatever. And so uh generally when you are debating about war, note that you probably need to have some very fleshed out reasons for why a war becomes likely, but also weighing on risk. I think there is an inherent value in making an argument about armed conflict that even if you can't say for certainty that it's 100% going to occur as a result of something, weighing that a risk of increasing armed conflict is still in itself something that deserves urgency because the stakes of armed conflict are simply so high and so intolerable. Um, but also, what you can often observe in armed conflict is like escalation, so increasing force during conflict, often characterized by like states trying to one up each other. A cause for that can often be like tit for tat conflict, in which states try to reciprocate novel ways of fighting war or targeting different things. Sometimes you'll have situations where provocative rhetoric between states simply kicks off a conflict because leaders now perceive the other state as a deep threat to their survival. Miscalculations as well can often happen where maybe states misinterpret military drills. Maybe there is a border skirmish as a result of misunderstandings between sort of on the ground units, but also things like desperation or just like revenge for historical armed conflicts as well. Um, it's also important to like characterize the scope of conflict. So, what states could be embroiled or sort of dragged into conflict, and then does that then bring in more armies, more potential harm that is going to escalate as a result of this? But also, I think there's a trend in like the study of war of the concept of escalate to de-escalate, which is like strike hard essentially at the power that you want in armed conflict against in order to try to intimidate them and make them back down, which when before the current armed conflict between Israel, the US, and Iran, in previous skirmishes and brief wars between Israel and Iran, I think that you can often observe, at least on the part of the IDFs, strategy, which is the Israeli Defense Force. They hit Iran quite directly with very powerful weaponry quite quickly in order to try to disincentivize Iran to keep going, and therefore Iran having to suffer more of that type of blowback. So states often perceive that you need to go from like dial it from like 0 to 100 very, very quickly in order for the war to just stop very quickly in general and hope that the powers can like just chill out as a result. But that is a very, very risky strategy. Generally, I think there's a couple different objectives of war. There is one, a limited objective war, which means that it often has like a specific goal or scope of operations. So that can look like a humanitarian intervention to stop a crisis. It could mean seizing specific portions of land or resources. And is generally characterized by a desire to not completely topple the regime or destroy the state or entirely annex. And annexation is just means like stealing it, bringing it into your state, claiming the territory. You might annex only maybe like one province or one state. An unlimited objective is like a broad scope war aimed at like total annihilation of the state. You want complete regime change, you want destruction of the entire government, or you want total annexation, occupation of their lands. Um, Often, I think anti-interventionists usually critique intervention under the presumption of like it being an unlimited objective war. Because often when you have an unlimited objective war in which you want to like topple the government, you want to completely enact a regime change, you will see things like power vacuums by removing that government. That could lead to things like instability, for example, or the like transfer of power could be unwelcomed and not wanted by the population who might give blowback, or that transfer of power might just be incredibly botched, and as a result, maybe the state falls into a state of like disarray and armed conflict, and you just essentially don't achieve most of your objectives. But I think many anti-interventionists would still defend things like humanitarian interventions or support defending a state facing an aggressor with an unlimited objective. So this can look like things like trying to stop atrocities, like moving into a state with military force, fighting to stop, say, the an attempt at genocide, or a hypothetical example. For example, those people who in the US who say that the US should directly intervene if China were to attack Taiwan is on the rationale of like, it would be upholding the status quo. It is maintaining the status quo and preventing regime change to essentially prevent instability, for example. Um, I think also, and then it's then quite handy to look at how war is executed on those objectives through a lens of like the strategic level of war, the operational level of war, and the tactical level of war. This is a framework that a lot of international relations scholars like to use. I think it's popularized by a professor called Sarah C.M. Payne. But essentially, the question of the different levels of war is how states align their military actions with their political objectives and their interests, in which it is often characterized by there being a broad grand strategy in which states, as Sarah Payne describes, coordinate all of their instruments of national power, which is their diplomatic power, their military power, their economic power, to achieve national goals. The first sort of lens that you can analyze maybe a military campaign or armed conflict through is the strategic lens. That's like the highest lens, which is just why are we at war and what is the purpose of the war? So are we looking at like maritime or continental powers, and are they fighting over trade routes or territorial conquests, for example? Is it an unlimited or a limited objective war? What is the scope of the war at the broadest level? You then move to the second level, which is the operational level, which is how you actually conduct said war. So it looks like the logistics and how you sustain the war. Is it a boots on the ground type war? Is it an air campaign? Are you just going to blockade the other state to try to starve them of resources? Are we doing this on land, at sea? What is our geographic and geopolitical positioning in terms of how we message about the war, and what assets we use in said war? And it's the broad campaign plans across different theaters of war. So, for example, the operational level of the current US-Israel-Iran war might be that we use like the US is using a lot of mid-air refueling of its like bombers and military planes in order to conduct an air campaign against Iran. There is then sort of the lowest level, which is like the tactical lens of war, which is the nitty-gritty and the what you're actually doing. So it's the individual battles, it's the casualty rates, it's the territorial changes, it's the chess pieces on the board, like your divisions and your battalions, etc., that you're moving around. It's how your weapons are performing. It's questions about, do we have the material capacity to take these types of weapons and use them on this target, for example? And Sarah Payne characterizes it quite neatly as trying to manage the on-ground chaos. And a common problem states face when conducting war is a misalignment between different levels and a very incoherent strategy. So it's often very good in when you're making analysis about armed conflict to differentiate between the difference between like a strategic defeat versus a tactical defeat. A tactical defeat, quite intuitively, is just like you lose the battle. Like maybe you're outgunned, maybe you're out strategized, you lose the fight, you lose the town, you lose the city, you lose the territory. Versus a strategic defeat could be characterized by you win lots of battles and you are more powerful than the other state that you are fighting, but you fail to achieve your main goal. And as a result, the purpose of the war kind of falls apart. A good example of this is like the United States in Vietnam, in which they were more powerful than the Viet Cong, but failed in their strategic objective of preventing communist expansion. And eventually, the south of Vietnam fell to the communist north. It's also important to appreciate how war has evolved. And a couple trends to observe is that despite economies of scale in manufacturing making lots of other non-war goods very, very cheap in the modern era, it has not made lots of modern munitions very easily manufacturable on a mass scale at a cheap rate. So, for example, like a guided missile, although we know how to build them, lots of states only have a select amount of them because they are so expensive to build and rely on very complex supply chains and lots of parts from many different countries and many different entities. But this is not always true. Like lots of states, for example, Iran have developed things like cheap unmanned aerial vehicles or UAVs and drones. And I think in debating, you will then often see potentially motions or arguments about like the implications of technology being unmanned, such as like a weapon being fired by something that isn't a human and a human having oversight over it. But it's also important to look at the dynamic of how a lot of offensive technology can be very cheap to produce. Like the Iranian drone that you can see on the screen here, I think like costs like less than 100,000 US dollars to create, but the technology to shoot that thing down costs millions and millions of dollars. And so as a result, we've kind of moved from a situation of like lots of mechanized infantry and tanks, etc., to just like cheap unmanned drones being fired at one another, and the hope that like you eventually use up the enemy's very expensive defense systems. So even cheap drones start to get through and do some damage. But it also then has implications for things like civilian casualties. Is unmanned vehicles going to kill more civilians because it's more indiscriminate and there isn't a human there to potentially hold back? Or is it actually going to be less discriminate because it can differentiate between armed combatants and non-combatants? For example, some people say that if we have smart mines, that mine might be able to look and detect if you are a soldier with lots of equipment on you and only detonate in that instance. I don't know if that's actually ever going to happen, but that's a hypothetical sort of dispute that I've seen in the discussions of like smart technology and technology being digitalized in the concept in the context of war specifically. Um, I think also then it's important to understand things like gray zone warfare. Gray zone warfare refers to when states use non-military or quasi-military assets to achieve political or their strategic objectives. So the goal is essentially to undermine and disturb the status quo of a state without a direct assault, which could trigger a full armed conflict. And they kind of lie in this sort of middle ground gray zone in which it's hard to say that they are an act of war, but it's also hard to say that they're hard to ignore them as just like normal peacetime activities. So they're below that war threshold, and they're often done gradually or even covertly, and as a result, maintain a degree of plausible deniability. So it might be the case that, for example, Russia has used middlemen in criminal networks to set fire to aid destined for Ukraine in European countries. Now, although the start of that chain of orders to do that is the Russian government and is the Kremlin, there's so many middlemen in there, and it's done quite covertly that it generates that plausible deniability and therefore cannot be boxed in as a traditional act of war, as you would see historically, where, say, Russia, I don't know, just fires a missile into a NATO country and just blows up the aid through that means, which would be an act of war. Um, So these can often look like things like cyber attacks, which are often conducted by private groups but are state sponsored. A good example is Iran and North Korea. North Korea once got really pissed that Sony made a movie about them that really embarrassed Kim Jong-un, and so Iran like hacked a bunch of like U.S. private entities, including Sony, but also can look like paramilitary forces and proxies. So, for example, Iran funds proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas across the Middle East, or China uses its Coast Guard, which can't be technically classified as like a traditional military, but gives them just enough arms where they can harass people in the South China Sea, but they're not considered like a full-blown navy. And so it kind of creates this awkward situation of is it an act of war, is it not an act of war? Or it can even just look like the West supplying weapons to Ukraine or like supplying weapons to a proxy, which is then used in an armed conflict, and different countries acting as middlemen to help and support other countries. But it can also look like things like infrastructure harassment. For example, North and South Korea put massive loudspeakers on the border and just blast different audio at each other to try to like annoy the troops or like prevent them from sleeping. Russia has been known to like cut undersea cables in the Baltics. I've got some pictures here, but like Russian ships have dragged, or not ships that you can directly attribute to the Kremlin, but probably manned by Russian crews, drag their anchors to cut fiber optic cables in the seabed to cause like disruption with internet and stuff like that. And those things are becoming more common. And global fiber optic cable networks are a pretty significant vulnerability point that a lot of people do not look at or don't know about, in which these could now become flashpoints, in which only maybe a few fiber optic cables run into a given state, and therefore cutting them or threats to cut them is now considered an act of war more than just gray zone warfare. Like, I think a good question to often ask when you're assessing this is like, in the hypothetical scenario where, say, Russia cut a fiber optic cable that just cut Estonia's internet access entirely, is that an act of war? What is the response? And it kind of puts the question of like, do you not respond very forcefully because you don't want to cause a war, or are you going to now be perceived as weak and therefore should respond in a tit for tat manner, but that could potentially escalate into something worse. So these are often the questions that states are dealing with when they are being threatened with forms of grey zone warfare or they're perpetuating it, because it could cause miscalculations or misunderstandings that have a sort of domino effect and that escalate into something more like a traditional armed conflict. An example of this is like the China's Coast Guard harassing ships and like colliding with ships in the South China Sea, which has a lot of implications for the tensions in the region as well. Then I think something that I don't think is very common in terms of like what's touched upon in debates, but nuclear weapons is also a very important dynamic in war. And I think mainly the thing to know about nuclear weapons is that of the concept of mutually assured destruction, which is the idea that like if people use nukes, everyone dies, everyone loses, and therefore no one will actually use them in an armed conflict because it is just a guaranteed that everyone is going to die. Um, I think a common thing to point out now is that a lot of countries have started to explicitly vow the expansion of their nuclear arsenals. And nuclear arsenals are stored on terrifyingly powerful and expensive submarines that are like out there floating in the water, completely undetectable. They're on missile launchers, they're on traditional bombers, etc. There is about 15,000 nuclear weapons around the world, that we know of, that most sort of NGOs can estimate, held by these guys on the screen here, most by Russia and the USA. Um, but they're the kind of like the end game of armed conflict. They are the worst case scenario. They have been governed by treaties like the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in the past. But it's very important to note that most of these treaties have expired and have collapsed, and the large powers who were party to them that set them up have not renewed them. Uh, that's a bit concerning, but that's a whole other bridge to cross. But we've also seen a growing amount of rhetoric about nuclear threats. For example, Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un saying that they're like willing to use nuclear weapons against conventional war, like as an escalation from conventional war. And the question of, are they bluffing to intimidate, or is that now a genuine policy or military doctrine that they're willing to employ? And this sort of erosion of the nuclear taboo, in which it is taboo to threaten the use of nuclear weapons, and everyone kind of just universally condemns it, that has sort of waned in the past sort of 20 years. But also just the US, the UK, France, num in China, numerous states have now begun to redevelop their nuclear arsenals, which is now reversing a trend of denuclearization, in which in the 1980s there were like nearly 100,000 nuclear weapons around the world, and then we dropped to like 15, 16,000. That's now apparently starting to creep up again because of the more uncertain security environment around the world. But also experts in armed conflict studies are not just concerned about things like the US and the US and Russia's nuclear arsenals, but also things like more limited nuclear regional conflicts between countries like India and Pakistan. I'm sure you've seen in the news about Israel and the Iran conflict, how one of the stated concerns of Israel and the US was that Iran might develop nuclear weapons because it was enriching uranium to the level that they would be able to build a weapon if they wanted to. Um, and I think often when you're looking at nuclear war and nuclear weapons, it's important to differentiate in the types of weapons that can often exist. So there are tactical nuclear weapons and there are strategic nuclear weapons. Tactical nukes are often smaller missiles like the one on screen. They are designed to be on mobile launchers. They're of a lower yield, but they are still quite devastating. And in a hypothetical armed conflict, would more be designed to be used against like military, like maybe like a moving army that's like moving towards your borders, for example, versus like a strategic weapon which is designed to destroy high value economic targets, entire cities, etc. And it's important to differentiate between these types of weapons when you're discussing nuclear armed conflict, because there is a debate about whether the transition to things like tactical nuclear weapons, even though they are smaller in yield, could be increasing the likelihood of their usage because leaders and heads of state might perceive their usage as less risky. And when I was talking earlier about the whole escalate to de-escalate incentive, there is growing concern that a desperate state in an armed conflict that is nuclear armed could use one or two tactical nuclear weapons to try to force the other powers to stand down, because of even though they're smaller, they are still devastating and overwhelming in their application. And maybe that risks further nuclear tit for tat escalation and then further nuclear conflict as well, which is like the worst case scenario in armed conflict in general. So like applying a lot of these different things, I think a pertinent case example is China and Taiwan, in which there is lots of gray zone warfare. There's lots of election meddling with cyber wise. There's threats to cut fiber optic cables. China is a nuclear armed state that is expanding its arsenal. If China did invade Taiwan and did invade the island and went full force amphibious invasion, it would likely be an unlimited objective to try to take control of the island. A lot of scholars who debate the sort of will they, won't they of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan point to things like the window of opportunity, China's aging population, the US is sort of still in the process of pivoting. Therefore, should we do it sooner rather than later to avoid the highest potential cost of the conflict? But also, lots of people point to the fact that, even without direct US backing, it is still a very difficult conflict for China to try to pull off, meaning that there's a large disincentive to do it. And because of the amount of trade that happens in the region that China is reliant on and benefits from, and that cooperation exists, there's now maybe a disincentive to go to war in the first place. A common thing that people point to in asymmetric armed conflict studies is the porcupine strategy, which is like a porcupine, you are quite small, but you try to make yourself as sort of prickly and as difficult to, I guess, pick up as possible. And pick up in this case means like successfully defeat or invade. So you use lots of small combined arms, things like Patriot missile systems, not Patriot, the handheld ones that can blow up tanks very, very easily, etc. Stinger missiles, I think they're called. So it's lots of cheaper arms that can still do a lot of devastating damage to large scale assets like tanks and bombers and military boats, etc. And so I think part of Taiwan's defense policy is trying to store a lot of these small arms so that it can inflict as much damage as possible on a hypothetical invasion by China. So further to that, this is a clip from a show that I really like called The Diplomat. I won't play it, but it's a very fun clip in which the vice president tries to explain nuclear submarines and like nuclear submarine bases to someone. And although it isn't technically real, it definitely touches on some important things like the remilitarization of the Arctic, which is a thing that is occurring, and also the United Kingdom's relationship with nuclear submarines, and Scotland's relationship with nuclear submarines as well. Those things in this show are touched upon, and they are very real, even if like some of the other things aren't. I'd recommend watching it. It's a very, very good show. Um, Cool. Moving on to alliances, organizations, and cooperation. A couple of key alliances to keep in mind when looking at the global order, and also you might encounter motions that talk about whether alliances should or shouldn't do something, is first of all NATO. NATO is a opt-in integrated military structure that the US, Canada, and some Western European powers founded. Europe has things like the Rapid Response Forces, which is like a conglomeration of different militaries, forces in Europe and the United States, to rapidly respond to things that threaten NATO countries. They have Article 5, which is a collective defense treaty in which an attack on one state is considered an attack on all. So if Russia, for example, was to invade the Baltic states, then all the other states would be obliged by the treaty to come and assist, and everyone would essentially go to war. It also then obligates minimum spending in terms of like on your military, 2%, I think is what's stated. But there has been pushes, especially by Donald Trump, for states to try to aim for like 3, 4, or even 5% of defense spending, which has been taken up by different states to varying extents. But there is a general consensus among lots of NATO members at the moment that they definitely need to up military spending given the uncertainties of there being an armed conflict in Ukraine. Um, there is then the European Union, which is a supranational economic union in which there is a level of integration amongst its member states to a level above the normal state that is has economic and also legal powers as well. So there is, the European court system, there is the customs union in which kind of, or for the purposes of trade, everyone in the European Union acts as if they are just one state, moving things across borders, etc. That's a very simplistic definition of it, but in effect, that's essentially what it acts as. And there's things like the Eurozone, which is a shared currency that a number, but not all of European Union member states use, and also the Schengen area, which is kind of like a open borders type policy, so you can cross between different Schengen states quite easily with less restrictions. Um, there is then ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is quite different to the EU. ASEAN is prescribes itself as going around things like the ASEAN way, in which it is built on consensus, non-interference, and a respect for different government systems, in which it has intergovernmental organization and cooperation, but isn't a supranational union in which the ASEAN members cede a level of sovereignty over legal matters and economic matters to a higher entity. Whereas as the EU, you do that. There's an admissions criteria. You lessen your sovereignty to some degree to the supranational, not natural. It's not a ghost. Supranational union, which is often a point of controversy, because states feel like they're losing control maybe of their domestic affairs. And there is often a debate in geopolitics about like whether ASEAN should strive towards like an EU style system, and whether ASEAN, as it currently is like a weak framework. But ASEAN definitely empirically has numerous examples of where they've built intergovernmental cooperation on things like migration, natural disaster responses, etc. There is also the African Union, which is kind of set up on the guiding philosophy of Pan-Africanism. So the idea of like unity and solidarity of African states and diaspora to achieve political goals in the context of Africa decolonizing from Western control and attempting to economically develop itself, given numerous African Union member states have some of the fastest growing populations on the planet. There's also the Pacific Islands form as well, which advances like regional interests and has cooperation among Pacific Island states. It's basically just a forum for them to discuss things, etc., and agree on things. There is also the Organization of American States, which has a sort of similar structure to the United Nations. Um, but in the past, it has been criticized as just kind of being like a tool for the US to just coerce everyone in the Western Hemisphere. For example, there was a declaration in the 20th century that like Marxism was incompatible with the Organization of American States. So as a result, it's a little bit controversial, but still exists, I believe. There is also the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So these are the countries that control most of the petroleum exports around the world, and they do things to meet and like they do things to meet and agree on like pricing levels, the rate of production, and the amount that of oil that they produce and therefore can export or keep. And so the decisions that these countries make together in the context of OPEC are quite important and can cause a significant impact on things like global oil prices. There is also AUKUS, which I'm sure most of you know about, which is the military cooperation agreement between the US, Australia, and the United Kingdom, in which Australia is apparently going to get nuclear armed submarines. There's also some other pillars of AUKUS about like intelligence sharing and other forms of cooperation as well. Um, there's then the CSTO, which is kind of like Russia's quasi response to NATO, in which they tried to get a bunch of like the old former Soviet states to agree to some level of cooperation. But the CSTO is kind of, some people say that it's a little bit defunct because Russia isn't actually assisting in security and like peace stabilization of the CSTO members. But the rationale behind it was like former Soviet member states cooperating on regional security. There is then the World Trade Organization is probably one of the most important ones, which is basically just the forum for the majority of the world states to get together and agree on like a uniform code of sort of rules for international commerce and international trade. Um, there is things like the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is a dialogue between the US, Australia, India, and Japan, which China has often perceived as like an explicit and provocative or a cooperation agreement to counter their influence and be quite hawkish towards them. Because it is framed as like a security dialogue about security interests in the Indo-Pacific. So I wonder what that could mean in the context of the US and Australia. But often when you are looking at alliance systems and international relations, you're looking at things like the hubs and spokes model, which is essentially the concept of like you have the hub and then you have lots of different alliance allies around it, kind of like the United States in the Cold War, where it had itself as the central hub and it had its Indo-Pacific bubble of Australia and New Zealand. It had its European allies to sort of project its influence around the world. When you're looking at alliances, you're also then having to factor in things like collective defense. For example, NATO has a collective defense treaty, but also the extent to which maybe these organizations prove or disprove the success of like liberalist cooperation in the international arena as well. Um, Other things to look at is stuff like do not more economic and less military alliances have an internal desire to militarize? So at the moment, there is like discussion about maybe the EU forming its own EU military adjacent to NATO. There's also like discourse about like if having alliances potentially worsens the scope of conflict. So, for example, a conflict between NATO and Russia, if counterfactually NATO didn't exist, could it have been more contained, for example? Um, I think also then it's important to look at the motives of actors in terms of how they go about building alliance structures and stuff. So, do they want to build up their influence and their soft power through economic reach because they want to have smooth bilateral relationships with another country? Or do they want to engage in things like hard power? So, an example here is China and the Belt and Road Initiative, where they build a lot of infrastructure projects in different states across Central Asia and also Africa as well, and have been known to give out very generous loans to those states. And when those states do not pay back the loans, in exchange for forgiving the loans, they seize the assets that they have then built for them. Things like ports, like there's a port in Hambantota in Sri Lanka that I think China has or at some point tried to take possession of when Sri Lanka could not fully pay back the debts from the loans that China gave it. As an example of sort of states strong arming each other in the context of cooperation and then like trying to use that strong arming to project their own power. But also, maybe you use alliance systems to try to minimize vulnerability. So maybe China tries to develop its relationships with Central Asian countries because it's very scared of the fact that in an armed conflict, the US could blockade the Strait of Malacca and cut off a bunch of oil imports to China. So maybe it wants to develop closer relationships with Central Asian countries in order to lessen the reliance on maritime trade routes. So these are often the incentives that actors um, uh, have when they are thinking about the types of alliances they're engaging in. But often it can come in forms of things like foreign direct investment, which is like basically a non-insignificant lasting monetary stake a company, an investor, an NGO, or a government may pursue in a foreign market. So it could be an example of like in the private sector, maybe a business based on the government's favorable policies towards commerce activities, exports in like a greenfield or a brownfield project, acquiring a foreign firm, or maybe just starting a whole foreign firm up from scratch in order to establish economic relationships in between the private sectors of two different states. An example is like Tesla building like foundries and manufacturing hubs in Thailand and Southeast Asia. It could look like things like joint ventures amongst firms working on different products or different initiatives together across transnational boundaries. But it could also do things like the state just directly funding projects in other states as a show of goodwill or in order to strengthen bilateral relations. It looks like capital injection, upskilling, and the transfer of knowledge as well. And one of the key reasons why states engage in that is that there could be a return on investment in terms of optics. It looks like they essentially look like a good actor on the global stage, but also it sort of shores up maybe regional security to the extent that when they inject capital into countries that maybe face instability, they could help to stabilize those countries and as a result avoid any disruptions to them if things were to get out of control, for example. Um, so there's lot like when you're talking about IR debates specifically, there's so much like dispute, so many arguments about foreign direct investment. Like we clash over foreign direct investment because maybe it creates more jobs, it raises quality of life if you're helping build infrastructure. Does it prevent brain drain? Did you make the facilities of that state get better? Some people argue that FDI is like a signaling of confidence and stability in the economy. Therefore, investors feel comfortable to move in and set up operations because they feel like there could be a return on investment. Um, but there's then disputes about whether FDI actually always leads to good impacts. So could FDI lead to very bad environmental impacts, such as if you set up like fracking or oil operations? Like maybe that's good economically because it gives the state resources and the state may profit from the export of those resources. But is it devastating to the ecology and the agriculture of that state, for example? There's also questions about where does foreign direct investment money go? Like, do you build a bunch of like oil drilling infrastructure for a country to help get their export economy up? But does none of that money actually go towards like tax revenue and therefore can be spent on the people in that country? And does it just go into the hands of like foreign corporations? But there's also concerns in FDI in the context of FDI about saturating markets with like foreign skilled labor to the detriment of locals. So, for example, in the context of China and the Belt and Road Initiative, China has often sent its own workers into some states to build certain projects at the trade-off of potentially local talent building those projects. But then there's the question of like if that talent necessarily exists and maybe that's justified in order for the project to still go ahead because there's still other types of economic benefits that the state could reap from those projects. So often when you're looking at FDI, you're looking at who is actually going to be receiving it on the ground and what does it further in terms of the state's interests. Um, I think that can often relate to broader foreign policy projects, which are essentially just like the state through alliances, through foreign direct investment, trying to maximize its influence or increase its influence. So the Belt and Road Initiative that I discussed, this is kind of like a visual representation of the Belt and Road Initiative, in which China has been developing ports and railway lines and other key infrastructure so that it can trade through multiple different avenues to avoid the sort of Strait of Malacca choke point between Indonesia and Malaysia. Other ones can be more militaristic, in which you try to militarize a region to secure it so that you can uphold your economic interests. So the US has currently been pivoting towards the Indo-Pacific and has set up a bunch of bases in the Philippines, for example, bases that have like naval assets, air assets as well to try to project US strength in the region. But also in terms of like more peaceful activities, Australia has a history of investing in things like the upskilling of public service and the economies of neighboring Indo-Pacific states like Papua New Guinea, for example, and often sends like talent and also some money and funding as well to try to upskill public service sectors and help digitalize them to make governance and administration in our neighbors' economies easier and maybe therefore bring in gradual benefits about like stability and stuff like that. Also, the stuff like recently, Australia and the UAE signed a trade deal Anthony Albanese visited the UAE in September last year. And so often maybe people point to symbolism being an important part of soft power. So, for example, do states put on vanity projects to try to symbolize their relationships to send a signaling effect of like a change in relations or that the countries are pivoting to try to benefit from one another? So, for example, like the UAE just kind of slapped the Australian flag on the world's tallest building as like a show of like the new era of the relationship. So often, it's important to look at like symbolism that may seem trivial, but actually kind of behind it reveals important policy pivots between states' multilateral relations, their trade, and the foreign direct investment that they're engaging in. And when it comes to just broader trade and commerce in the economy, I think often you can observe empirically that over the past couple decades, there's been increased amount of interdependence. Um, and humanity has become very reliant on naval supply chains, and those supply chains are very, very complex, and they exist between private entities and state-owned entities, and citizens and consumers, etc. So on the map, those circles in red are more choke points of where so much global trade geographically goes through. But also, as a response to this, the world has tried to develop multinational regulations to reconcile things like the differences between legal systems and how different countries might have different principles for things like contract law and like what is considered fair in commercial arrangements. So jurisdiction is often a complete massive legal mess in commerce. So states have tried to develop instruments like the 2005 Hague Convention to try to like streamline international commerce. So, for example, states to that party to that convention are obligated to have laws which stipulate that private entities that engage in commerce with other country, like entities in other countries, have to specify like a choice of jurisdiction for what laws they want to use, what courts are going to like maybe adjudicate disputes, etc., in their contracts. And so there's been a significant amount of multilateralism and successful multilateralism to set up structures in order to smoothen out international commerce. And international commerce is then quite broadly characterized by countries exporting something, so you're sending something out of your economy to other economies, or importing, which is bringing things from other economies into your economy, which often talks then points to things like trade deficits. A trade deficit, which you may have heard a lot about in the context of Donald Trump's tariffs, is the essentially situation where you import more than you export. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. Countries produce things better than other countries. There's a theory in economics that I won't really go into called like comparative advantage, which states will specialize and prioritize things that they have a comparative advantage in compared to other states. That's a whole other ball game to try to deal with. But to some extent, systems have tried to set themselves up around concepts like that. But also, I think you can observe that there's been a historical failure of fanatical self-reliance, where countries have tried to set themselves up as being completely dependent on themselves internally and trying to minimize the amount of things that they import, for example. But there has been some success in that, but there's also been lots of monumental failures. For example, in the 1940s, Italy famously tried like an autarky policy to try to make themselves very uh, independent in terms of goods and resources, etc. And it did not go well and caused a lot of economic damage to the Italian economy and to the Italian people as well. But to go further, the world has, as a result of this increasing interconnectedness, developed a system called Incoterms, which essentially govern the rights and obligations around things like payment and carriage for logistics and freight forwarding. So it's essentially these things have essentially been an attempt to have similar systems to ensure a level of market stability. So there are universally agreed principles about like whether an exporter or an importer should pay different things at different times, or who is responsible for what, and sort of governing norms when it comes to the carriage of goods and services. And I think this is quite important to know, given that like most of the global economy is contingent on there being like stable exchange of goods and services between different economies. But this also relates to things like tariffs and stuff. So a tariff is just a tax or a duty imposed on an import. It is paid by the importer. So if you are a wine business in Australia and you import French wine, and the Australian government introduces a tariff on French wine, you as the importer would cop that tariff at like the port of entry when it arrives in your country. You would have to pay for it. Um, tariffs are not intrinsically bad or good. They are merely an economic tool. So some people who are in favor of tariffs say that you can use tariffs to disincentivize buying foreign goods to protect domestic industries. Maybe an industry is really, really important. It employs tens of thousands of people, but there might be another country out there who does it better. And therefore, if you import from them or let people import from them, it could threaten the stability and the viability of your domestic industry. So a tariff might be a way of protecting your domestic industries and making sure they're the ones who are getting the income from the demand that exists. But some people say that, con of that is that you have increased production costs because supply chains are very complex. Countries are very rarely completely independent on things. And therefore, when you import lots of key parts from different countries, you're just raising the costs, which inevitably go to the consumer, because often as businesses pass on the added costs to consumers. Um, they're moving in a different direction in terms of like economic dynamics is sanctions. So sanctions are coercive measures applied against states and non-state actors. They can be economic things like restrictions on the trades of goods and services. So for example, there's lots of sanctions around like purchasing coal from North Korea as a means to deny North Korea income from the sale of coal, but also could be like restrictions on movement, preventing people from migrating to countries to work. Often in debating, when we're talking about sanctions, the contentions are like, are the sanctions effective enough to actually promote change? Like one of the reasons why countries introduce sanctions on other countries is because the country is doing something they do not like or the international community doesn't like. And that often is then contingent upon discussing like how specific are the sanctions? Are the sanctions actually hitting industries which are going to which the country is reliant on and therefore causes enough economic damage to incentivize change? To what extent is a country able to insulate itself from sanctions? How resilient is their economy to kind of determine if sanctions are actually going to do anything if you implement them? But also, one thing people talk about a lot when it comes to sanctions is who is actually impacted when you introduce a sanction. So a lot of people will say that sanctions cause suffering amongst the average people who haven't actually done anything wrong because it's denying them critical goods and services that they're reliant on. And but some people say that you could hurt the leadership. For example, if you freeze the assets of like Russian oligarchs and like seize their homes and seize their liquid cash that are in foreign banks, maybe that hurts the people who are in charge, and therefore they are incentivized to change things. Um, Another question that people often dispute in the context of sanctions is how easy they are to circumvent. Like I once saw this documentary that was like a bunch of North Korean businesses were getting around sanctions because they would just change their legal name and therefore they would no longer be on a sanctions blacklist. A sanctions blacklist is essentially just a list of countries where it is now illegal to trade with. So the US will have a sanctions blacklist, and lots of countries will share sanctions blacklists and cooperate on sanctions blacklists and are then obliged that if they find out that a private entity in that state is like engaging in commerce with a sanctioned entity, that they should be legally penalized as a result of that. Um, cool. Moving on to another thing, more on multilateralism is the United Nations. So the United Nations was formed after the First World War, after the Second World War, sorry. Like in the ashes of like so much destruction and suffering. But the sort of rationale for a UN style system had already existed. So after the First World War, a bunch of countries came together after the Treaty of Versailles and put together the League of Nations. Uh, it didn't work out very well because World War II happened and kind of fell apart. So when the UN was founded, they developed like the UN Charter with the aim to prevent conflict. They set up the General Assembly and also the Security Council as well. So the General Assembly is that big room in New York full of like every recognized member state to the UN, and also has the International Court of Justice sitting under it. There's then the UN Security Council, which has like the permanent founding members who all have veto powers, and then also have like rotating non-permanent members and discuss things like peacekeeping operations and security matters around the world. They're the most important ones to keep in mind. For example, the United Nations Security Council can authorize things like peacekeeping operations. Often, peacekeeping operations can be directed towards the types of flashpoints that we've discussed before. There are examples of success. For example, there is a UN peacekeeping presence on the island of Cyprus in the Eastern Mediterranean, which kind of divides North and South Cyprus in the context of like Greek Turkish conflict in the past. So there has been some success there. But there's also examples of failure in terms of UN peacekeeping. For example, UN peacekeepers tried to stabilize regions of Somalia, and they it didn't go very well, and lots of people ended up dying, and it wasn't super successful. But I would recommend reading more into those specific cases if you want to find out more about it. But states pledge their support towards peacekeeping operations. So the UN Security Council might authorize an operation, and the country kind of puts their hands up and says, "Okay, I will give you military forces to conduct the peacekeeping operations as well." But there's also then a problem of like certain regions of the world perceive peacekeeping operations as just an imposition of like Western forces and Western influences through the mask of it being like a UN authorized operation. In terms of international law, there is two international courts. There's the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. The International Criminal Court primarily prosecutes individuals and focuses on international crimes, but is limited to the scope of only a couple different crimes, and only in the states of those who are party to something called the Rome Statute, which not every state, for example, the United States, is not party to the Rome Statute, and is kind of reliant on state cooperation. The International Court of Justice deals with disputes between states and focuses on issues of international law. It's more bought into, it has more binding decisions and broader jurisdiction. Um, there is something. This is a fun fact. There is something called World Jail in the Hague or Hague. I don't remember how you pronounce it in the Netherlands, where people who are like waiting trial or are convicted of international crimes go to prison. Um, and it's in the Netherlands. I found out about that a couple of years ago, and I thought it was quite cool. There is also the law of the sea. So this is kind of like an uh, agreed upon convention where countries have something called their territorial sea, which is like 12 nautical miles from their coastline. And then also their exclusive economic zone, in which countries can navigate in their EEZ maybe, like for peaceful purposes, but that country has exclusive access to that for the purposes of economic benefit, for example, maybe resource extraction. But it's a bit complicated because different countries dispute where the EEZs start and where their territorial seas start. Does it start, at a certain distance off the continental shelf? A bit of geology and geography comes into it as well. I'd encourage you to read into the law of the sea. It's very, very interesting. Um, in terms of the International Criminal Court, it prosecutes mainly four different things. Firstly, is genocide. Genocide is defined as the intent to destroy in whole or part an ethnic, religious, or racial group. It secondly prosecutes crimes against humanity, which is just widespread and systematic assaults on civilians that may fall short of like a full attempt at destruction of a people. There's crimes of aggression, which is like an attack on states and their sovereignty and their territorial integrity in some form, and then war crimes, which are like contraventions of the law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law. So for example, recently I think the former leader of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, was charged with crimes against humanity, and then extradited to the jurisdiction of the ICC for a trial, and I think he was found guilty and then extradited to them for extremely violent anti-drug policies that he implemented in the Philippines. But in terms of like war crimes specifically, because I think people kind of throw around the term war crime and don't differentiate it from other types of crimes that the International Criminal Court prosecutes. But the law of armed conflict and international humanitarian law is built upon a couple pillars. Firstly, the Geneva Conventions and customary law. Firstly, Geneva Conventions, and second is customary law and like previous historical norms. And it applies between states, within states, states and non-state actors. It governs all forms of armed conflict, and it governs the conduct of states in said armed conflict as well. Its key principles are distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants, things like proportionality, and humanity, and the obligation to minimize suffering. Proportionality basically just means like you don't massively scale up your military action disproportionate to what has already happened to you. Um, in terms of like the International Criminal Court, there is a map. Not all states are party to it and therefore buying to it. Its processes are often argued as being long, delayed, and therefore ineffective. And some people say that its lack of scope also makes it ineffective. But it has prosecuted some people. There are prosecutions that happen on the basis of those four different crimes. Then there is the issue of insurgency in geopolitics. I think the most poignant event to point to when it comes to insurgency is uh, after 9/11, George Bush made this speech called the Axis of Evil speech, in which he declared a bunch of states to be like state sponsors of terrorism. Those states were like North Korea, Iraq, etc. And this is a map here of like countries where there has been recent or ongoing insurgency-based armed conflicts to some degree in the past sort of like 10, 20 years. Um, but in terms of things to note about like insurgency is that it is a very complicated manner in which there is a common saying that a one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. There is also, you have to take into account also the legacy of colonialism, in which maybe insurgency is created by artificial borders, creating significant dissatisfaction and the perception of illegitimacy in terms of people's authority over certain lands, sparking like people to rise up and engage in armed conflict to correct that essentially, or from their perspective to attempt to correct that. There is also the impact of things like poverty on recruitment. Do people turn to fighting for insurgencies as a means of income because they have no alternative? Are they coerced to do it? There's also the Cold War legacy. Like it's some of the context behind things like um, uh, insurgency in the Middle East is that like the US funded a group called the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to fight against the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. A lot of that funding, a lot of the people they gave weapons to, then became things like Al Qaeda and stuff like that post the Soviet Union being booted out of Afghanistan. But is often characterized, many insurgencies are often characterized by things like religious fundamentalism, such as ISIS or Al Qaeda, or also fights for self-determination, like the Zapatistas in Mexico. Um, and often, like the reactions in the West has been to use armed conflict to try to put down these insurgencies, but also at home it has done things like stoking Islamophobia and people having a very unnuanced and discriminatory understanding of how people interact with insurgency and how insurgency works. An example of this is like the Houthis, who began a civil armed conflict following a power vacuum. They're a proxy of Iran, and they have threatened shipping in the Red Sea and now control the western portions of Yemen as well. This region faces massive humanitarian crises. It's difficult to send aid as a result of the armed conflict there, and aid agencies have had to compromise with the Houthis in order to get aid to some people. And as a result, it's created a lot of distrust of Western aid and has become a flashpoint with Israel and Iran because the Houthis have launched missiles at trading in the at like ships trading stuff in the Red Sea. Um, Often insurgency is characterized by guerrilla warfare and asymmetric warfare. So one smaller power fighting a much larger power with things like close quarters urban combat, or historically, if you look at like the Viet Cong in Vietnam, using like small arms warfare in the jungles and using the thick of the bush to launch things like surprise attacks, etc. The past 20 years, the US has spent like trillions of dollars on the war on terror. Many would question to what end? What have they strategically achieved in that instance? But also, lots of people criticize responses to insurgency, which are called counter-insurgencies, as leaving instability and power vacuums, and doing no good, essentially. But moving away from this, but it's still related, is something called the responsibility to protect. This is a sort of a doctrine in the international community that states have an obligation to protect their populace from war crimes, things like genocide, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is essentially the mass expulsion or killing of an ethnic or religious group. And the responsibility to protect doctrine is essentially a doctrine where states have an obligation to help states to prevent these things, but also domestically, like states first and foremost should prevent it domestically, but second of all, have a collective duty to stop states from doing it to their own populations, and there being a level of like international community action based on it. This was developed in response to things like Rwanda and the genocide in Rwanda, and also like war crimes and some genocide in Kosovo. And as a result, it is essentially the international community trying to recognize that in some instances, armed conflict may be necessary based on UN Security Council resolutions and authority to prevent terrible tragedies. So people aren't just kind of standing by and putting their hands up. Examples of this have been things like interventions in Sudan and Libya, in which there has been an element of R2P approval. Maybe states cite R2P as like their justification. You'll often see, like, for example, the United States justified an intervention in Syria on the basis of the responsibility to protect certain peoples in Syria. But the caution of when you hear those things is that like those states are just unilaterally citing responsibility to protect without UN Security Council approval, and may actually go beyond humanitarian intervention and humanitarian support there as well. There's also a controversy that responsibility to protect has kind of slid away in relevancy because it's selective in its application. So we kind of turn a blind eye to maybe the war crimes of large Western states, but kind of focus on other states disproportionately, even if their war crimes are smaller in scale to those of the larger states that control the UN Security Council or have the veto on the UN Security Council. This kind of moves into humanitarianism. So humanitarianism as a whole has a couple of principles. Firstly, is the alleviation of suffering. So it is to be impartial and independent. It is merely to give humanitarian aid on the basis of said suffering, regardless of like political affiliation and stuff like that. It is then, as a result, unconditional. Well, a lot of people then dispute whether humanitarian aid should be unconditional or whether it should be utilitarian. Should we just kind of give it out as much as possible, or should we actually assess who we give it to and assess the implications of it? There is often debates in areas of humanitarianism about to the extent that a humanitarian aid can actually damage different societies. For example, international humanitarian aid into Pakistan saturated the market with a foreign produced type of agricultural product, from my memory, is one example. And as a result, it kind of undercut the local market and caused a lot of damage to the economy for people who are reliant on it for things like jobs and income. But also, like there has been aid programs that have been launched in places like West Africa, and in Ghana, for example, in which the operations have been botched in their execution and they've failed to incorporate local expertise and like local understanding of things like medical practices. And as a result, lots of local populations have lost trust of foreign aid programs and humanitarian assistance and kind of view it as like a Western imposition. Like there's a famous example where international humanitarian aid to Haiti was heavily criticized because they kind of assumed that Haitian doctors were unqualified or Haitian surgeons were unqualified, and so they just kind of stopped them from trying to help out in things like medical facilities and stuff like that, which made a lot of people angry and then kind of reject some of that aid as well. But also, some people say that foreign aid is a important strategic tool to countries give foreign aid in order to like leverage their long-term relationships with different countries. This map here is kind of a map of like what are some of the most pressing humanitarian crises in the world. Humanitarian crises can often be just characterized by things like acute hunger, famines, water shortages, and then subsequent things like displacement and refugees, and people being forced into things like refugee camps and not having long-term sustainable shelter, or being forced across borders, etc., to try to escape things like persecution or armed conflict. Um, then that kind of moves into a concept in international relations called the Anthropocene. We're close to the end. I'm just going to keep all of this recording so people can watch back if they want. The Anthropocene is essentially a concept in international relations that challenges the fundamental focus of most IR theories, which is the focus on nation state entities interacting. So it kind of is predicated on the basis that like the Earth is primarily impacted by a layered and complex system of human interactions with the environment and each other, in which everything is essentially interconnected through these sort of like artificial constructs of national borders. Scholars of the Anthropocene argue that we are at such a pivotal shift in world politics, in which the planet's dominant, in which we are kind of the dominant force on the planet, and as a result, we are manipulating the planet and changing the planet quite a little bit. In the context of the things that we do to the planet can then have reverberations on us to the extent we're talking about things like ecological habitats, the viability of agriculture, for example. In the concept of like the Anthropocene in IR studies, there is the line between domestic and international impacts is blurred, and traditional conceptions of the state boundaries are kind of obsolete because it's all based on the idea that lots of Anthropocene-based issues run through ecological boundaries, not arbitrary borders, and key security questions kind of shift away from traditional dilemmas of material power towards things like security of the environment, given it has a direct impact on human life. So it looks at things like security on planetary ecocide, human extinction, how best to manage the relationship humans have with the planet. Um, some of the things that the Anthropocene looks at is things like the impact of climate change on causing more people to become displaced from more natural disasters, drought, increasing sea level, rising sea levels, but also things like resource wars to the extent that maybe increasing global temperatures is decreasing the amount of arable land that we can use for agriculture, but also things like economic instability, etc., being caused by many of those different environmental factors, especially agricultural instability, to the extent that we all need to eat. Probably bad if agriculture is destabilized because of man-made ecological disasters. Um, it's this often touches on things like the impacts on small island states like the Pacific Islands, and debates about whether we should abandon those islands and whether we should try to like move population centers away from high risk areas in terms of disasters. This is an example of a motion. It was the Australs Grand Final last year, which talked about Pacific Islands in the context of sea level rise. So these definitely do pop up in debating. But the Anthropocene kind of sits under the umbrella of non-traditional security in international relations, which is the idea that traditional security is focused on state survival, military capacity, and questions of the use of force, whereas non-traditional security is transboundary. It's not relating exactly to the material military capacity of states, but definitely still has implications for the capacity of states to protect their populations. So that's why, as I said before, it is often framed as threats to human security, spanning borders without those artificial constraints. It can look like disease, pandemics, human trafficking and organized crime, environment, climate, terrorism, water and food security, and cybersecurity as well. An example of this is transboundary water governance. So, what are the implications of maybe states that share multiple large river systems, like the Mekong Delta in Southeast Asia, damming different points of the river? Does that have an implication for potentially drying up sources of water for other states? Do states use transboundary water governance as a like a policy to weaken their rivals and bring them under your control, to the extent that if you control the upstream source of the water, maybe that incentivizes the other state to comply with you as a means to keep that water access going. And a good example of this is like Ethiopia damming upstream in the Nile, and how this can create geopolitical tension because the implications are maybe like uncertain water security for the states that are downstream from the dams, and certain states gaining like essentially monopolies on the controls of water. In terms of natural disasters, because that I think is pretty related to the climate, natural disasters can have a major significant implications for geopolitics because they can exacerbate existing crises such as poverty to the extent that they can destroy people's houses and people's communities. They can also weaken governance when damaging key infrastructure and causing societal disruption as a whole. They also then impact supply chains, impact prices, can cause delays and shortages. They can impact tourist economies if people are disincentivized from traveling as a result of disasters. Um, but it also can act as a bridge for bilateral relations to the extent that lots of countries try to go to other countries and help them in response to disasters that happen. An example of this is the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. I think this picture in the middle at the bottom here is a picture of a part of the Sumatra region in Indonesia, I believe, that faced the tsunami, or the brunt of the tsunami, and the region was devastated and lots of people died. I think in the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, it's estimated that 250,000 people died across the different states that are on the Indian Ocean, and it could be a lot higher. It is only an estimate, but as a result of that, it spurred a lot of international cooperation on doing things like establishing warning systems, but also resolutions to govern future disaster management. And it also drew in large-scale international aid for recovery. Numerous states poured in money and resources to help with the recovery, just because of the scale of the disaster, but also a lot of foreign citizens that were in places like Thailand and other tourist destinations ended up being caught in. So states kind of had no choice but to send lots of resources because they had to get their own citizens out of the disaster area. But also, I think it's important to look at disasters in a non-natural sense, which is like human-caused disasters in the context of war. Like the environment and ecosystems, and thus the habitability of certain areas, can often get embroiled in armed conflict. So, for example, a dam in southern Ukraine was blown up and it caused massive flooding in Ukraine. But also things like bombing. The US recently bombed an oil infrastructure near Tehran in Iran, and it caused a bunch of like chemicals and oil to go into the air, and it was an ecological disaster. Like it started raining oil and like acid rain in Tehran. Um, and I think that the picture in the middle is a picture of like what the sky looked like as a result of it. And also like weapons testing, like nuclear weapons, has left numerous Pacific islands irradiated. Like the dome on the right there is a dome in the Marshall Islands, and inside of it is just a bunch of radioactive material that they put a bunch of concrete on to try to stop it from leaking out. So often I think environmental disasters from conflict can have an enormous scope. Like if a nuclear reactor were to melt down hypothetically from like a drone strike or like a missile strike, it could impact millions and millions of people. And it's often perceived in studies of war that if a state does cause a massive ecological disaster through warfare, like intentionally, that is often considered a major escalation, given it has massive consequences and implications, and could potentially constitute things like war crimes to the extent it might be a disproportionate harm towards civilians and non-combatants as well. Um, that's basically most of sort of like the main subject material. In terms of like different major events in international relations that a lot of this relates to, and kind of gives you an idea of how all of this has been built up over the past 80 years. Well, you had the end of World War II and the setup of the UN and the different major international institutions. Broadly across the 1940s to the 90s, you saw trends of decolonialization. So, for example, Algeria gaining independence against France in the 1950s and 60s, Indonesia and also India gaining independence from the British Empire, and just a trend of decolonization, which took several decades. It was very painful, it was very, very bloody. But a significant number of countries gained independence from their Western colonialists. Also, the founding of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949. You can see on the right here, it was basically designed to counter the Soviet bloc of influence in the Red countries. Um, there's also the Korean War, and that was a sort of UN task force that was put together to intervene to prevent North Korea from entirely seizing the southern part of the peninsula. This is kind of considered the forgotten war, just because it had major implications, but people don't discuss it in as much as like the Vietnam War, for example. Another pivotal moment in like geopolitics in the 20th century was the Bandung Conference, which was the formation of the non-aligned movement, in which basically a bunch of states tried to reject the binary of you must choose either the capitalist West or the communist Soviet bloc and the Soviet East, and tried to sort of create a non-aligned movement based on promoting their own self-interests. There was also a pivotal moment in something called the 1956 Suez Crisis. I'll just plug my laptop in which essentially the US and France and the UK tried to invade Egypt to maintain control of the Suez Canal. And the US basically said, no, 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 we have a rules-based international order now. We have the UN. You colonialist powers can't do this unilateral armed conflict stuff anymore, or at least in the same way. And it was a major strategic failure for the French and the British, and they were essentially forced out. And a lot of scholars signal this as like the turning point in which France and Britain kind of lost a lot of their unilateral projection capabilities around the world. Um, there was then the Vietnam War, in which the US for years slowly escalated its intervention there, but eventually failed and had to withdraw. Uh, a key concept that underpinned this was the domino theory, in which the US thought that if one state fell to communism, the neighboring states would then subsequently fell to communism, and the US was terrified of that possibility. So they intervened militarily in Vietnam because the communist North, or they were scared the communist North would turn the South communist. There was then also the nuclear arms race between the US and USSR, so testing of large nuclear weapons, the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and just more lethal technology. In 1961, the Soviet Union tested something called the Tsar bomber, which is like the most powerful bomb that's ever been used on the planet. And it kind of signaled just how terrifying the nuclear arms race was becoming. Like over a projection over Brisbane of the bomb would have like destroyed the entire city. So things were getting completely out of hand, and these states were spending billions and billions of dollars on their nuclear arms, which ultimately culminated in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which a lot of international relations scholars consider to be like the closest moment that we have come to nuclear annihilation. Because the Soviets stationed missiles in Cuba, and as a result, the US threatened to invade Cuba. It set up a blockade, and it was a 3 week period where basically everyone kind of held their breath, and we seemed to be on the brink of a full-blown armed conflict between the US and the Soviet Union over nuclear missiles in Cuba, which people thought would just end up becoming a nuclear war. The USSR then invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and eventually they failed and they had to withdraw about 10 years later because the US helped a lot of the Mujahideen and people in Afghanistan to fight them. Uh, then in China, Deng Xiaoping reformed a lot of the Chinese economy towards a socialist market economy, essentially like capitalism with Chinese characteristics, and started to reform away from command and control based economics of his predecessors like Mao Zedong. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, which kind of started to signal the fracturing of the Soviet Union and the reintegration of Germany. Then in 1991, there was the Gulf War, in which Saddam Hussein of Iraq invaded Kuwait, and a military coalition, international coalition, was put together to liberate Kuwait. And this is often characterized by like the ecological harms of Iraq, setting fire to oil wells, which caused a lot of environmental harms, and also just the desire for Saddam Hussein to control Kuwaiti oil fields as well. So this is a very, very important armed conflict when studying the Middle East, and also just the incentives of states to go to war in general. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed into its individual republics collapsed. There was non-violent and also violent revolutions that resulted in that. Um, in the 90s as well, Yugoslavia, as a result of lots of internal ethnic tensions and armed conflict, began to collapse in multiple different states. And there was also a military intervention by NATO in the West to prevent things like war crimes as well. In 1992, it was the formation of the EU with the Maastricht Treaty, which started to set up a lot of those formal institutions and things we discussed earlier. In 1994, there was the Rwandan genocide, which was one of the events that sparked things like the responsibility to protect doctrine and wider discourse internationally about when intervention can be justified and when it's not justified. In 1995, the WTO was formed as the world tried to sort of like formalize systems of globalization. And in 2001, China joined the WTO and rapidly modernized because it became a key manufacturing hub and attracted a significant amount of foreign direct investment because it could offer companies cheap labor and became a massive export powerhouse, which resulted in one of the fastest economic modernizations in human history. In 2001 as well, began sort of the war on terror when the US was attacked on 9/11. George Bush declared the axis of evil and state sponsors of terrorism. Then a bunch of coalition of Western countries invaded Afghanistan and also invaded Iraq as well to enact regime change and go after different terrorist organizations. But during this time as well, separate from insurgency, NATO began to expand a lot. Lots of countries after the Soviet Union collapsed began to join NATO because they were scared about like the potential for the Russian Federation to come after them again into the future. In 2011, there was an event called the Arab Spring. This is often important in the context of talking about the role of social media in international affairs and revolutions, because a lot of particularly young people across the Middle East organized pro-democracy rallies and demonstrations across the region. Quite a number of them unfortunately failed, and as a result, lots of armed conflict and bloodshed occurred as a result. But there were some examples of success. I think Tunisia is an example of where the Arab Spring had success in inciting democratic reform. But as well, in the same year, the UN Security Council authorized a NATO, um, sorry, there was a bit of dispute as to the UNSC authorization there, but there was a NATO intervention into Libya, and eventually the fall of the Muammar Gaddafi regime. Uh, Also, as a result of the Arab Spring, Syria, and also and this guy here, Bashar al-Assad, uh, beginning to be violent to his own people, and being engulfed in an civil armed conflict. And a lot of the armed conflict and destabilization of the region resulted in what's called the European migrant crisis, where lots of migrants began to flood into Europe from places like Syria and Iraq, and as a result, lots of them unfortunately died because they came across in like small boats and were not able to be saved. But also lots of them used like land borders and started making their way to countries like Germany and Sweden, for example. And there were lots of implications in that, in such as like the rise of right-wing populism, xenophobia and Islamophobia, and the perception that like people who were trying to migrate out of areas of armed conflict were potential security risks. And a lot of right-wing populists try to foment fear about like not being able to them trying to change European culture and not assimilate, etc. It is a very hot button topic, and it contributed to things like Brexit in 2016, where the UK voted to leave the European Union, and that was finalized in 2020. Also around this period of time, there was armed conflict and stuff in Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, in which there was a genocide of a minority called the Rohingya after a coup in 2021. Definitely look at Myanmar as a case example of armed conflict and revolutions. It is very, very interesting. Across this period as well, you had COVID, supply chain shocks, and travel restrictions. And then the US withdrew from Afghanistan. It was a very messy operation in which the Taliban successfully regained power. And it's kind of perceived as like a strategic defeat for the US because it spent 20 years in Afghanistan to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. And so a lot of people cite that as like the US losing a lot of its international influence across the world. In 2022, Ukraine was then invaded in a full-scale invasion by Russia, which has had significant implications on global supply chains because Ukraine exports a lot of grain and also oil as well. In 2023, or a couple of years ago, civil war reignited in Sudan, and there's now been situations of extreme hunger and also crimes against humanity in places like Darfur, and has drew in a lot of uh, like military investment from countries like the United Arab Emirates and even Russia to some extent, and has kind of become like a little bit of a geopolitical arena for other countries exerting their influence on different armed actors. In October 2023, there was a further escalation of a decades-long struggle between the Palestinian people and also the state of Israel as well. And as a result, there's been a pretty devastating spark up of armed conflict in the Gaza Strip, on top of lots of violence in the West Bank. And as a result, many people characterize a genocide as having occurred and the attempted destruction of the Palestinian people, and also the situation of like lots of Israeli citizens being taken hostage by Hamas fighters and being taken into the Gaza Strip, and then lots of military operations being stated as an attempt to get those people back. But as you can see by the pictures, there was a lot of carpet bombing of Gaza. Then in 2024, there was the fall of the regime in Syria, and this was a decades-long political dynasty that basically fell apart in a very rapid operation in 2024. It was quite significant. 2025, Israel and Iran escalation. The US bombed its nuclear facilities. Then there was a bunch of tariff stuff. Global markets got really scared about Trump's tariffs, his reciprocal tariffs. And then this year, Trump has struck Venezuela, kidnapped its leader in a quick regime change operation. And now we are facing an armed conflict between the US, Israel, and Iran, which most of you are probably aware of. So that is kind of a non-comprehensive but still important list of events that has built up over the past 80 years that often interrelate with one another. Um, I think this is taking quite a while. It's been nearly 2 hours. So hopefully different parts of this will have helped or given you useful knowledge at some point as well. I'm going to distribute the link to the recording, and I'll probably make some timestamps to different areas. But the slides that I'm showing on screen are kind of the last things that I had written up, being looking at like case examples of how the Strait of Hormuz, I can't pronounce that properly, is an example of like risk calculus in geopolitical commerce, because even though Iran can't blockade the strait with its navy because the navy's been destroyed, the perception that like you could get hit by a drone, it means that international shipping companies are just avoiding using the strait. It's also now being talked about as like an example of a strategic failure, because we've had weeks of fighting and the regime is still intact despite the loss of some key leadership, but also oil prices around the world are starting to spike significantly because things like oil facilities are being hit and starting fires. An example of like the tit for tat escalation that I talked about before is like the US struck Iranian facilities which extract from the world's largest gas field. And then as a result, Iran struck back at the other side of that gas field. And then the world kind of freaked out because it represents a significant portion, a significant percentage of what is exported to the rest of the world. So that is an ongoing, very fraught situation that has the potential to escalate and have serious ramifications for the global order, especially in terms of things like oil prices, because oil prices impact logistics, they impact food, they impact the fertilizer is produced significantly in the Middle East as well. So fertilizer prices have gone up and inevitably probably will continue going up. So everything is interconnected, and therefore, when things like this happen, it becomes extremely messy. Um, that's essentially everything that I want to talk about here. Um, Tips for IR debates. I've kind of gone through this throughout, but having a clear prep strategy is very, very useful. Understanding the comparative difference between different things that are happening, what is changing in the world when you enact a policy is very important to characterize. What are actors' incentives? Where do they stand to benefit or lose to then inform those incentives? And that also then ties into things like ideology and government structure. What type of government structures are likely to do what, so on and so forth. Try and generally prove that, particularly if it's an action debate, you're putting states in a better position. Where will this policy pivot a state to? And then also analyzing the internal domestic impacts, but also the external geopolitical impacts as well. Best ways to do this, do some current affairs reading before a competition. But if you don't know that much about a state when you're debating IR, maybe just apply like some general psychology to the states and remove the info dumping. Sometimes common sense analysis can win, especially if not many people understand IR in the round itself. Or sometimes people who know a lot about IR will info dump a lot of stuff in the debate and not prove anything, and not mechanize anything. And then all the knowledge that they have, which is great, doesn't really get them anywhere. So sometimes when people are info dumping in IR debates, kind of take a step back and go back to basics. Um, there is an example topic that I would use at like internals to break down these types of things. But that is essentially everything that I have on IR. I hope some parts of that were useful. Um, Message me, have any questions. I happy to yap about IR at any point. I like IR. I study it. And I'll save the recording and distribute it if people want it as well. But thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Owen. That was sick.
Thanks, Angus.
It was really good. If you, yeah, send through that recording.